the first head of the library was a young woman, an 18-year-old woman.
How did that happen?
It's completely baffling. I mean, I remain puzzled by how you could hire a young woman to run the library, and yet she was not actually allowed to use it. Totally, as much of history is completely mysterious.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life. Thanks for coming tonight.
I'm thrilled.
So you moved to LA in 2011.
Right.
And how did you first hear about the library, the fire at the library? How did it get on your radar?
It was entirely an accident, and a bit of serendipity. My husband and I had moved to LA, and soon after we had moved there, I was asked by the Library Foundation to give a little talk for their patrons. As a thank you, the head of the Library Foundation offered to give me a tour of the downtown library. And I was very excited because I didn't know that LA had a downtown. And I enthusiastically agreed. And I met him at the library a couple weeks later as we were touring, and I fell in love with the building. It's a wonderful, magical building. As we were wandering around, and it had already been bubbling in my head that libraries might be interesting to write about, we stopped in front of one of the bookshelves, and he pulled a book off the shelf, and he held it up, and he took a big whiff off of the book. And I stood there a little awkwardly and thought, am I supposed to pull one off too? And I don't know what to do.
Is this an LA thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is the new world I live in.
Book smelling.
Yeah, and I just kind of bumbled and said,
What's the
what's
deal?
up? And he said, you can still smell the smoke in some of them. And I was still puzzled, and I said, well, did you still let people smoke in the library? And he said, no, the smoke from the fire. I said, what fire? He said, the big fire, the fire in 1986 that closed the library down. And the minute I heard that, it was just library and fire, it clicked. And I instantly thought, I have to learn about this. I have to know more. When I went home that night, I just immediately started searching online to find out as much as I could. He also said, and I failed to mention this, because I kept saying to him, tell me more, and he was like, come and let's look at this lovely piece of sculpture. And I was saying, no, tell me more about this fire. And he said, yeah, it was an arson. And I thought, whoa, I really have to learn about this.
Right.
And I immediately decided, based on nothing more than my incredible gut response, that I was going to write a book about it. I mean, really, even without knowing more than that.
So tell us, what was the fire? Like, what happened that day as it began to erupt?
It was a very ordinary day. This was April 1986. It was about 10:30 in the morning, and the fire alarm went off. There were about 200 patrons in the building and 200 staff people. Nobody reacted with great excitement about the alarm because the building was in pretty bad shape. The fire alarm went off a lot. Nobody took much notice, although they very dutifully evacuated the building. And, with a great deal of annoyance, like, all right, we'll do this and get it over with. The fire department arrived, walked through the building and said, nothing here, it's a false alarm, and we'll just reset the alarm. They went to reset the alarm, and it wouldn't reset. So their first thought was there was something wrong with the alarm system, but they decided to walk through the building again just to make sure they hadn't missed anything. And they went into the stacks. And I don't know how the stacks work here, but these are small rooms that go all the way up to the top of the building. And they're just lined with books, and it's where all the books are stored that aren't out on the shelves. And they went into the stacks and saw a tiny trickle of smoke. And they tried to radio to the other firefighters to say, there is some smoke here. But I don't even think at that point they were particularly concerned. And then suddenly it erupted. The fire ended up burning for 7.5 hours. And it reached at some point over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure how that would convert, but
Hot.
It was super hot. In fact, some of the firefighters told me that the flames went from being red to orange to being completely clear, and that they found it absolutely terrifying that this fire was so hot it had no color. When it was finally put out, after those 7.5 hours burning, they did a quick assessment of what had happened. 400,000 books were destroyed, and 700,000 were damaged.
The book, you're fascinated by the science of fire, and that comes alive in the pages of the book. I am a sucker for stories about the triumph of the human spirit and human ingenuity, and I was equally fascinated by how the books were saved and preserved, and what intelligence was poured into that effort.
It was amazing because, first of all, without any notice to the public, except news reports about the fire, 2,000 people showed up saying, "What can I do to help?"
It's amazing.
And one of the things that was immediately necessary was to get the damaged books out of the building and put them into a freezer.
Right.
Most of these books were wet, and they were also smoke damage, and some were burned, but many of them were wet from the attempt to put the fire out. If a book is wet, you have about 48 hours to either dry it or you have to freeze it. Otherwise, it'll mold, and
Mold
you'll
is
never.
the big fear.
Yeah, and if it molds, it's hopeless. So somebody had to find someone who had a freezer that was big enough for 700,000 books. I can suggest to you that I would not have a freezer as big as that. And in very short order, the people at the library contacted the frozen food companies in LA and begged them to make space in their freezers, which they did. They pushed aside the broccoli and the shrimp and made room for books. But you still have to get 700,000 books out of the building. The people of LA showed up and formed a kind of human chain, passing books out of the building into boxes, and the boxes were then carted off to the frozen food companies, where they stayed frozen for 6 years.
Amazing.
Then there's the issue of what do you do with 700,000 frozen books? You don't merely put them outside on a clothesline. It was an incredibly complex effort that drew in some of the aerospace companies that are based in Los Angeles to try to figure out how do you take a book that's soaking wet, and these books were drenched, and get the water out and flatten the pages and hope to save the books. Now, one of the things you might think is, why not just get new ones? Well, you don't just buy 700,000 books, and many of them couldn't be bought. Many of them were books that were no longer available. So there was a real premium on trying to save these books and restore as many as they possibly could.
So when you first had the tour of the library by the city librarian, why was he so confident it had been arson?
The fire department determined it was arson because their estimate of where the fire started was on a bookshelf where there was nothing that could have sparked a fire. It was just a bookshelf and books. So the way some of the logic in arson investigation works is if a fire were to start right there and there's nothing here to spontaneously combust, the assumption then is that it was arson. Because, and a lot of lawyers would tell you that this principle is incredibly faulty, that you prove the existence of something by the absence of other things.
Right.
So there's a lot of controversy about using that way of determining that an arson occurred. But in defense of arson investigators, it's incredibly difficult to figure out where a fire started and how a fire started.
Right.
So the analysis was they believed it started on these shelves, and consequently, because there was nothing else there that could have started it, it must have been started by, as they say, an open flame in a human hand.
So before there was a library to burn, there was an evolution of this library. Along the way, there's an amazing cast of crazy characters who ran the library at various times. It's also, there's a story embedded in this history of women's empowerment, because libraries were, and I had never thought of this, but of course it makes perfect sense, given what we know about history, bastion of male intellectual contemplation, an elitist operation, and there would be like a ladies' room where women could maybe read lady-appropriate material.
Right.
But that all changed. How did it change?
Well, it is fascinating because until I started working on this book, it had never dawned on me that libraries began, in many cases, as men's only institutions, private subscription libraries, and then even the public libraries were for men only.
Right.
The LA Library, which had its origins in the 1890s, as you said, it had a ladies' room, even though, weirdly enough, the first head of the library was a young woman, an 18-year-old woman.
How did that happen?
It's completely baffling. I mean, I remain puzzled by how you could hire a young woman to run the library, and yet she was not actually allowed to use it. Right. Totally, as much of history is completely mysterious. This really changed, and the feminization of libraries began in the 1920s when Andrew Carnegie began building libraries. Right. And Carnegie had basically put out the word that he would build libraries in cities that would then agree to support them with public money. And so there was a huge scrambling to get a library in your town that Carnegie would build. And then what happened, interestingly, is that many of the towns that didn't get a Carnegie library went ahead and built their own library. And libraries sort of exploded. My guess is this was true in Canada as well, but I'm speaking for what I know about American history. Libraries just exploded. And I think it was a moment when the idea of the public good of the library really was embraced. So suddenly there was a problem, which was there's so many new libraries and not enough people to work in them.
Always a good moment for women.
Yes,
to
and
jump in and seize some power.
And added to that was this idea that women could be persuaded to work in the library for less money than men.
Also a familiar story.
It's uncanny. But the part of the story that's kind of fabulous is that women not only entered the library field at that point, but then they totally dominated it. And in a very short amount of time, the entire profession became feminized. It just was taken over by women, and it's remained, I mean, the balance is not as extreme as it had been because there are many more men entering the profession at this point, but women really entered it with gusto. And of course, during the war, during these periods of time where society suddenly thought, oh, all those ladies sitting at home, they could do something. And how about if they come and run our libraries? So it was it was fascinating to me to see that evolution and a few of the bumps in the road.
Right. So one of the most entertaining parts of the book is about Charles Loomis, who is an extremely vivid character, and he deposed a lady librarian.
Right. The library in LA was run by this very capable woman named Mary Jones. She'd been running it for 5 years. This was in the very beginning of the century. She was also the first head of the library who had actually gone to library school, so she was particularly qualified. 5 years into her professional life at the library, there was a meeting of the Board of Library Commissioners to which she was invited, and she was told, you've done a wonderful job and we would like you to resign because we'd all agree, and certainly you would agree, that it would be better to have a man run the library. To Mary Jones's credit, and she is kind of heroic, she said, actually, I don't agree, and I'm not going to resign. And she refused to resign and launched what became known as the Great Library War, and thousands of women marched in the streets of LA
For the
in
librarian.
support of her. And Susan B. Anthony and a number of other nationally known suffragettes showed up and in support of her. And it became a complete standoff, which was eventually resolved because the mayor went to the city attorney and said, you've got to help me out here. Give us a legal ruling on this. He not only he fired the Board of Commissioners, but they refused to resign too. So you had this absolute insane standoff. Charles Lummis, who had been hired for the job, decided to go on a fishing trip to avoid all of this and disappeared. The city attorney finally, this was an era where there was absolutely no job protection. There was no protection for anyone, and you could be fired by someone just saying, well, you're a woman and we don't want a woman in the job, and it was legally supportable. So ultimately, Mary Jones turned over her keys to her office and left. She kind of had the last laugh because Charles Lummis, though he was a brilliant man and did many interesting things in the library, interesting in all sorts of ways, she went on to run the library at Bryn Mawr, which is a women's college, and is well remembered as one of the best heads of the library. Charles Lummis, in the meantime, left his own legacy, which is a remarkable one, and he's really one of the most interesting people I've ever written about.
So much of your book is about, really, the hidden subject is about books themselves and how we treasure them and how we care for them, whether we're putting them in a freezer or card cataloging them. You also talk about how powerful they are when we symbolically burn them. And there's a chilling section about book burnings throughout history, of which there have been many, many, above and beyond the most famous ones. And of course, I was reading all of this in the context of a world where fact is under assault, and the president has disrespect for journalism, and thinking about what happens in a culture that has no reverence for fact, research, books, the printed word. Were you thinking about present day realities when you were writing on the destruction of books?
It was, I began the book in what felt like a very different era.
Right.
And the change in the culture made the book feel really urgent in a way I hadn't anticipated. And not only was it about the respect and love for books, it was also about the belief that there can be shared space that is inclusive
Right.
and that celebrates the idea of a community working together with open doors. So the world for Americans certainly changed dramatically, and suddenly I felt like I was writing a very timely book in a way that was, actually I was going to say that was covert, but I'm not sure it was that covert. I think we've seen throughout history what it leads to when people try to disregard or destroy books. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm not trying to say that people are being slaughtered in the United States, and I don't want to exaggerate it, but throughout history, there's been a one-to-one correlation between cultures that destroy books and cultures that destroy people. It's incredibly chilling. And one of the things that I found so pointed was that there's no particular value in destroying a library, say, as an act of war, except as a statement, a symbolic statement of dominance, of even more than dominance, of a statement of erasure, that you as a people are being removed from the memory of the world. All of your narratives, all of your stories, your history, your knowledge is being literally wiped off the memory of the earth. And it's really frightening. And people respond to it that way because books feel that close to us, that the destruction of our books feels like a wound that's human.
I follow you on Twitter, and this is like a whole new way of communicating, and you're delightful and entertaining. And I'm wondering if you enjoy it, whether you find that a valuable and meaningful part of your life, if it's opened up doors for you, if you find it to be a waste of time that you're addicted to, or what your relationship is like with Twitter.
You know, I got on Twitter actually quite early on. And I was writing my last book, Rin Tin Tin, and at the time we were living out in the country, and I was desperate. The only thing I could do to take a break from work, because we were living out in the country, was weed my garden. And not that that's not a very worthy way to spend your time, but I yearned to have a water cooler to go and hang out in an office and shoot the breeze for a few minutes and crack some jokes, talk about the movie I'd just seen, and then go back to work.
Right.
And, I tried doing this with my husband, and it's just not the same. Much as he was great company, but when I'd say, guess what movie I saw last night, he knew, because we watched it together. So I wasn't enjoying any of that kind of ambient social life that I was really craving. And a friend said, oh, you should get on Twitter. And I didn't understand it at all.
Sure.
And then suddenly it became that water cooler. It was a wonderful way to kind of take a break from writing and sort of chat a little and read a little and crack some jokes and spout ridiculous opinions and give a status report on my chickens and my book and then go back to work. It was sort of perfectly tailored to what I needed. Every now and again, I feel like, what have I gotten into? I'm never going to be able to quit. And at this point, it's too late because I've been doing it now this is the second book that I've done where Twitter was my water cooler. And I enjoy it. I find it, I feel like I know a lot of the people who
Yes.
I chat with on
Right.
Twitter, which is a whole new way of thinking about knowing people.
Right.
But I don't think it's artificial. I think it's like, in A Wrinkle in Time that those creatures had another sense that they couldn't explain. Well, I think this is another sense of knowing people that just didn't exist before. And it doesn't replace real friendship or real interaction. It's just a whole new version of human interaction, which I'm really grateful for. I find it almost always an interesting experience and a pleasant distraction that is just enough that at some point I start thinking, well, every now and again, my editor will tweet at me and say, I'm watching.
Get back to work.
And I think, oh, oops, back to work. And I'm sort of glad he's there.
Right.
But it was a little alarming the first time he said, interesting that you're on Twitter and your book's 2 years late.
Right. So, on behalf of everyone in the audience, I have to follow up and ask, I'm sure everyone here is wondering, what do you mean you're chickens?
Oh, well, I'm a chicken farmer. I live now 3/4 of the time in Los Angeles, but we also have a farm in the Hudson Valley in New York. And we used to live there full time. And I have, when we were living there full time, I had chickens, ducks, geese, and guinea fowl and turkeys. And if it hadn't been for Twitter, I would have been doing my water cooler break with my turkeys. So I think the world is better for me getting on Twitter. But I now just have chickens due to an unfortunate raccoon interaction.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and my chickens, a friend takes care of them when we're in Los Angeles.
I know also from following on Twitter that you've started recently playing the ukulele.
I'm proud of it, and I've been carrying my ukulele with me on my book tour.
How's it going?
Well, it's coming along. The thing is that you have these weird chunks of time when you're on book tour, and after you've seen hour after hour of CNN, and you think, okay, I've got to do something else. And it's sometimes hard to read when you're traveling like this. So I had been shown how to play ukulele in October and decided I was going to take it with me on tour because I could actually
portable.
practice and it's portable. The problem is people think I'm a professional musician, and I feel like saying, no, I know one song, and it's not very good. Because a few people have said, well, you should bring your ukulele on stage and play a little. And I think, no. You got me all wrong. But it's been a great companion, and I feel like at the end of this long book tour, I'm going to be kind of a virtuoso.
Awesome. You mentioned in your book that before you had the idea to write about the library and its fire, that you thought you were done with writing books. Why is that?
My books take a long time, and I feel
It's the Twitter.
It is. That's the secret. When I wrote Rin Tin Tin when my son was a baby and then a toddler. And I think the one piece of wisdom I have is either write a book or have a toddler, but don't do them both. It was really challenging.
Right.
And it's hard for me to do an easy book. I'm not drawn to subjects that are easy, and I'm the kind of writer who feels that I need to learn everything about the subject before I can begin to write. So they turn into these long projects. When I was done with Rin Tin Tin, I thought, I think I can live happily and just write magazine pieces and write 140 characters on Twitter, and I don't need to write another book. but of course, writing a book is incredibly gratifying. And when I heard about the fire in LA, I literally couldn't not do it. And I remember saying to a friend, I think I'm going to write this book. And she said, friends don't let friends write books. And I thought, uh-oh, too late now. But I think it was just that feeling of, do I want to go back down into the mines again and dig my way for 5 or 6 years? Because as much as I had said to my editor at the time, and this one's quick, I'm going to do this one. This will be like my 1-year book. Maybe he never believed me, but because he didn't seem shocked at the end of that year when I said, I think I need a little more time.
Right. You have had quite a bit of experience seeing your books turn into movies. I understand there's a TV project associated with this book. Is that true?
Yes, it's really, actually incredibly exciting. And I decided to co-write the pilot, which is something that I've never really, I wrote a screenplay years ago, but I've never written for television. And I never particularly thought I wanted to. But the idea of actually taking my own material and shaping it, it really intrigued me. So I'm going to work on it.
And it'll be a collaborative process? Like, how does that work? How will it happen?
You know, I'm going to co-write it with a writer-director who's really wonderful. And I haven't asked him yet, like, do you write one line and I write the next? Or do you play certain characters and write their dialogue and I write the other dialogue? I'm not really sure. I think part of the reason that I'm really excited about it is after you've spent 6 years alone working on a project.
No water cooler.
Water cooler. And the idea of collaborating is really, really exciting and feels like a wonderful change of the texture of my daily life. I'm very excited about it and very curious to see how it's going to turn out.
Amazing. You've been on tour for how long now?
I started October 16th.
And have you been mostly in libraries?
Almost all libraries. I've only done 2 events that weren't in libraries, and consequently, I've seen some amazing libraries. It's really been fun.
Anything in particular stand out?
Well, the one that was my personal favorite was Kansas City, and their main branch of their library is in an old bank. And the bank was enormous. It was I don't remember what bank it was, but it was a huge downtown bank building. So it's got this extraordinarily beautiful wrought kind of interior, and the vault for the bank, which of course you could never remove, and in fact you really can't remove it because it's part of the support of the building. They made it into their screening room when they show movies at the library, so you're in this bank vault. It's so cool. It's great. And some of them are just exquisitely beautiful, like the Peabody Museum in Baltimore. They're just one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever been in. It's really been wonderful and interesting and also very gratifying to see these places bubbling with life and with a kind of energy that feels really of the moment.
In the research you did about the modern library and its many amazing, diverse purposes, what were the most surprising things you discovered libraries do that you don't think of as a library thing?
Well, this was not in North America, but the library I visited in Denmark has a marriage license bureau in it, and you kind of think, well, that seems like an unusual thing to have in a library. There's a few libraries that have, you can borrow seeds for your garden. There's a lot of loaning of things besides books, which is really interesting.
The Toronto Public Library lends musical instruments, for example. We lend Wi-Fi. You can take Wi-Fi home and use it in your house. We do all kinds of crazy stuff.
And the funny thing about this, because it seems like the most amazing newfangled notion of libraries, but one of the heads of the LA Library in the 1890s, a woman named Tessa Kelso, had the idea that the library should loan tennis rackets and sports equipment and puzzles and toys. And, you know, she believed that a library should just be a common lending center
Right.
of primarily books, but anything that would be an interesting thing to do, the library should loan it to you. So she sort of was ahead of the curve by whatever 150 years, but I feel she deserves the credit.
Excellent. I do think librarians in this age where civic space and public discourse is somewhat compromised have been great champions of free speech and advocates for the freedom, intellectual freedom. I know that this sometimes is a challenge for libraries. You describe, you know, librarians have to figure out where to draw the line when people are on, you know, with the material they're taking out, with some of the discourse they're having, with what they're watching on computers. How do modern librarians balance those two goods?
I think that as a profession, it's expanded exponentially in terms of the purview of what they are tasked with, as well as some of the challenges. For instance, and I mention this in the book, you can watch pornography on the computers at the library as long as it's not illegal. It's not child pornography. It's not, it doesn't fall into the category of being illegal. And I mention this, and I mention it in the book, and a few people I know were sort of shocked and horrified. And I said, well, you know, I think librarians feel that that's a matter of choice. If it's not illegal, why should the library say you shouldn't be watching that? There are all sorts of challenges that they face, and I happen to think librarians are pretty heroic. They have taken on so much more than just learning the Dewey Decimal System, and they work in a social capacity that many of them probably never anticipated, of helping people find social services and mediating between a homeless person and someone who's bothered by the homeless person. And this is it's part of being a librarian. It's part of being the steward of a public place that probably was not part of the job 100 years ago by any means.